Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 US states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the two hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon neutral economy, while the US rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinars homework for the students, and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes. Thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forward, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Howdy. Welcome back to the Bureau of Economic Geology's Austin Earth Science Zoomerama. Today's presentation is from a team of geoscientists with the Bureau's own Gulf Coast Carbon Capture Center. They will address several topics relating to climate change and its mitigation through carbon capture and storage in their presentation entitled CO2, Too Much of a Good Thing? Thank you for joining us.
Hey everyone, so thank you Linda for introducing us. So my name is Margaret. I am currently an undergraduate at UT studying geology, and I'm also minoring in computer science and women's studies just for fun. So I've been at the Carbon Center for about 2 years, and it's really helped me hone my interests. So when I first started at UT, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and I've kind of been able to develop what I wanted to do through doing this research. So today I just want to talk to you about how greenhouse gases work in the atmosphere and kind of what they do. So yeah, how do greenhouse gases work in the atmosphere? So to start off, I want you to imagine two different situations. So first, imagine it's 25 degrees outside and you're driving in this convertible. Think about, do you think it'd be comfortable to sit in this car? And it might be obvious to you, the answer is probably not. So our second situation, it's 100 degrees outside. This is Texas, it's July, your car's been sitting out in the sun for maybe 2 hours. And again, think about, do you think it'd be comfortable to sit in this car? Probably not. So it might seem like obvious questions, but the car scenario really helps us understand what's going on in Earth's atmosphere. So here we have the Earth. You can see this thin layer of gases that goes around the Earth. It's composed of several things. Some you can see I have carbon dioxide, water, and methane. So the way this works is our rays from the sun, our light energy, will come down through the atmosphere and hit Earth. And then it will transform into heat energy and bounce back up to this layer of gas, this atmosphere. And when it hits those greenhouse gases, some of this heat energy, you can see it comes back down to Earth, and some of it goes out into the atmosphere. So what happens if we have more greenhouse gases, more of that heat will end up staying inside that layer of gas, inside the atmosphere. So as we put more greenhouse gases, you can imagine our atmosphere getting thicker and thicker. And so it's very helpful because it can help protect Earth from the cold, like dangerous space, like in our 25-degree car. But sometimes these greenhouse gases can be a little bit too much. So Austin will explain a little bit more about why this happens.
Hi, my name is Austin, and I'm going to be talking about how greenhouse gases work on a very small scale. So like Margaret, I'm an undergraduate majoring in geology, and I'm also majoring in chemistry, and I'm a member of the Longhorn Band and the organization Texas 4000 for Cancer here at UT. I've been working as an undergraduate research assistant at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center for about a year now, taking old scanned graphs from wells and digitizing them so that we can have the computer data and see which wells would be good candidates for carbon sequestration. So for the past 50 years or so, the term greenhouse gas has been becoming more and more common in the media, just as the gases themselves have been becoming more and more common in the atmosphere. So many people don't really know what the words greenhouse gases mean despite this, although you might think images of industrial smokestacks spitting black fog into the atmosphere. But as Margaret talked about, greenhouse gases do one thing. They let sunlight in through the atmosphere, but they prevent the heat that comes in with the sunlight from escaping. But how does this work? What about these gases makes it so that they trap heat in the atmosphere? There are several greenhouse gases, with the main ones being carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, chlorofluorocarbons, and water vapor. Carbon dioxide is the main gas that human activities emit, and it gets its name from its structure: one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. Di equals 2, oxide equals oxygen. So what are some activities that you all can think of that produce CO2? If you thought of combustion, then that's right. As you can see the picture above, burning a fuel in a transportation vehicle is one of the most common ways of releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so produce this. Every time you ride in a car powered by gas, you're really riding on a bunch of small, rapid combustions. A greenhouse gas like methane, however, may come from less glamorous places, typically from decomposition in places like wetlands or from fermentation inside of livestock animals. So that's right, a large part of methane emissions come from cow burps and farts floating up into the atmosphere. Gross. So all these gases have an important common feature. They're all made up of 3 or more atoms, while the 2 most abundant gases in our atmosphere, oxygen and nitrogen, have only 2 atoms. Because of these extra atoms, they have different ways in which they can move. So think you have a rubber band and you're holding it between your thumb and index fingers and you're stretching it back and forth. No matter which direction you're stretching it, it's only moving in one direction. Now add a weight to the middle of this rubber band, something heavy enough to cause the rubber band to sag a little bit. And this is pulling it down and essentially adding an entirely new direction of motion, as you can see from the image at the top of the screen. This is essentially the effect of an extra atom in the greenhouse gases, and this added direction causes the gases to be more likely to interact with the heat energy that comes in with the sun. So think of a person walking down the street calmly with their arms by their side versus someone flailing their arms in every direction. Which person do you think is more likely statistically to bump into something? Typically, it's going to be the person flailing in every direction. These pictures. The heat energy that the gases absorb is called infrared radiation, and it's the trapping of this energy high in the Earth's atmosphere that causes this change in climate on a molecular scale.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Franey, and I work as a graduate student with the Gulf Coast Carbon Commission. This is my 2nd year as a graduate student and my 6th year in total being at the University of Texas. Currently, I'm working towards understanding what the coast of the Texas looked like about 20 million years ago. We as researchers kind of have a hunch that the Texas coast is a great place to store CO2. So we're trying to understand exactly what it looked like 20 million years ago and where we could put this carbon dioxide. Okay, so as Austin mentioned before, we have a couple ways that greenhouse gases, that they arrive in our atmosphere. One is being from cars that we drive around in every day. Second, as you mentioned, are from those cows, but not all of us are farmers. So we can think about a couple other ways that we produce CO2 every single day. For example, if you took a hot shower this morning, how did that water get hot? If you had breakfast this morning, did your gas stove, where did that gas come from? If you ever put on any makeup today, where do those products come from? So all these products have their basis in fossil fuels, and as a result, they all have CO2 that goes along with them. And this isn't a bad thing. Many of these products are necessary. It's things that we use every single day. But we just kind of need to understand where they come from and how much is too much. So looking at this chart here on the right, this shows the amount of CO2 emissions from different sources within the United States. And so looking at it, we can see the 2 major ones are transportation, just like Austin mentioned, driving cars, driving trucks, how do we transport all these goods across our large nation? And the second major category is electricity. So whether that be from heating our homes, electric stoves, hot water, how do we power the Zoom that we're having? This is all coming from the burning of fossil fuels and the releasing of CO2. So how exactly do energy sources release CO2? Well, first we can think about how humans breathe. So when each of us take a breath, we're inhaling oxygen. This oxygenates our blood, and at the end of it, we release CO2 when we exhale. Now, you can take that analogy and apply this to combustion. Of course, there's no breathing going on, but we can kind of look at a candle to see. So the candle is our energy source. It is combined with oxygen and then the flame, and the result is we have energy, which in the candle's case would be light, and CO2 and water vapor. So if you think about a power plant, that is just a really industrial-sized version of this reaction happening. And instead of that energy being light like a candle, it's the energy that powers our homes, our computers, anything that requires electricity coming from these reactions. So what you need to realize is that this isn't too much of a bad thing. If there's a balance in the world, so the CO2 that we're releasing from the power plants or from us breathing or from the cows that Austin mentioned, if those can be balanced out by natural sinks, that's okay. For example, plants in photosynthesis, they take in the CO2, they photosynthesize it, and they release oxygen. But the real problem is whenever this swings out of balance. So looking at the left here, we can see that it seems like the CO2 used by natural processes and the CO2 in the atmosphere is all balanced, all is well and good. But when this swings out of balance is whenever problems can arise. And we can see that really nicely on this next slide here. So this graph shows the last 400,000 years on Earth. And the line shows the amount of carbon dioxide in parts per million within the atmosphere. And going along, you can see that there's a nice cyclical curve. It never gets too high, never gets too low. This is because the amount of CO2 in the air is balanced. We have a nice cycle going on. And then finally, at the very, very end of this graph, you can see that red line skyrocketing up. And that's from the result of human interaction pumping more CO2 in the air. It seems like we're swinging out of balance, and that's something we need to worry about. And so that's why the work we're doing at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center is really important, because we're trying to mitigate these risks. And to learn a little bit more about how we can mitigate these risks, my friend Harry will talk to us about reduction.
All right, perfect. Thank you, John, for passing that off to me. My name is Harry Hull, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Texas, pursuing a master's in geology and a researcher at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center. I previously received an undergraduate degree in geophysics, also from the University of Texas in the Jackson School of Geosciences. And really, the reason that I chose UT at the end of the day was the ability to get involved in science from an early point in my career, and really pursue my passion for research, as is exemplified by my research currently working with the Gulf Coast Carbon Center. So I'll share my screen, and what I'm going to talk to you guys today is about what we can do about CO2 and how we can reduce our emissions into the atmosphere. All right, so while CO2 emissions have the effect of warming our planet, the good news is that many engineers, scientists, politicians, and others have worked on finding solutions to this growing issue. Generally, there's two methods to address the carbon dioxide output into the atmosphere. So the first of these is going to be shown up in the upper corner of this slide, which is reducing our carbon footprint, which is the amount of CO2 that we're responsible for. And then the second of these ultimately is going to be capturing existing and created CO2. And so, let's see. The first of these that I'm going to talk about is going to be reducing our CO2 emissions. And so a question that you guys can think about is, how can we as individuals in our daily lives reduce our carbon footprint, from every aspect of our day. And so I'll give you guys some of the answers that I've been able to come up with. But of course, this isn't a conclusive list, and there's many more that you can think of yourself. And so, of course, some of these are going to include walking or biking places, as opposed to driving a car, carpooling or using buses or public transportation when available, driving more efficient cars, turning off unnecessary lights, or using LED lights, which tend to use less energy. Also, using less heat or air conditioning when possible, reusing and recycling plastics, purchasing green products such as wool or wool clothing, as opposed to other synthetic fabrics, which often contain, are made from fossil fuels as well. And then, of course, it is 2020, so of course we can always use reusable masks as opposed to disposable masks. And then, of course, buying local products, which tends to remove fossil fuel usage from the supply chain. And then, of course, many other options as well. And then, that's kind of what we're able to do on the, as individuals within a society. But we also, as a society, can address our carbon footprint as well at the city, state, or even country or global level. And so, what we can do about this as a society is another question that's important to think about. And so, maybe on the bigger picture, some of the things that we can do to address this CO2 use are switching away from dirty fuels such as coal, planting trees to offset CO2 use, using alternative energy sources such as wind, solar, geothermal, and hydro. And I, of course, just listed the basics. There's many others that are being considered as well. You could name here. And then so the second method for dealing with CO2 emissions or reducing CO2 emissions in the atmosphere dealt with what we can do with the already existing and already created CO2. And so that's a question that I would like for you guys to think about as well, and is also something that we study here at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center. And the answer to that question is carbon capture. And so ultimately, there's a lot of CO2 that we produce that is a necessary byproduct for just living our daily lives. As I've previously listed all the ways in which or John previously listed all the ways in which we use CO2 every day. And so ultimately there is going to be some amount of CO2 that we output, and capturing it and storing it in the ground is going to be one thing that we often are able to do to really reduce the CO2 in our atmosphere. And so ultimately, another question is, okay, what if you capture it? Where can you store it? How do you know where you can store it, permanently, so that it never enters the atmosphere again? And so that's another important question to address. And ultimately, this is a carbon storage, and what we do is we store it under the ground. And that's why geologists like myself are really get involved in the world of climate science, because these geologic reservoirs and geologic sandstones that we store these in are really important in the process known as carbon sequestration. And with that, I'll pass it off to Miliana, who will talk more about carbon sequestration and carbon storage.
Thanks, Harry. So hi everyone, my name is Miliana and I'm a graduate student at QT studying energy and resources. I finished my undergraduate 4 years ago majoring in geophysics, and after that, I spent most of my time on rigs in the middle of the sea working for a national oil company. And so during my time exploring the earth resources, I figured out about carbon capture and storage technology. I also found out that many of the things I have learned and done during my study and career can be applied to put back the CO2 underground. So last year, I flew across the globe to Austin to start my master's and working at GCC to find the best layers in the earth to store CO2. So right now, I'm going to be continuing what Harry has shared to you before about carbon capture and storage. So yeah, what is carbon capture and storage? Well, as you might have known, there are so much amount of CO2 released from fossil fuels, especially in power plants that produce energy for our daily use, as John has explained earlier. So most of those emissions are currently emitted to the air and cause global warming and climate change, just like what Margaret and Austin has explained before. So meanwhile, in CCS, we channel those CO2 emissions into power plant that will send them back into the earth. I guess you might be wondering, how can we store emissions underground? Isn't it going to be dangerous? So, sorry. Right now, I want you to take a look at this styrofoam cup, and I'm going to show you what's going to happen if we bring it deep into the ocean. So yeah, as you can see, they shrink because of the high pressure in the ocean. The same thing happens with CO2 as well. So if I blew up a balloon, the balloon will be filled with CO2 and it would be as big as my face, or as you can see in the slide, it will be as big as this probably. But actually, deep inside the earth, the pressure and the temperature are higher than here up on the surface, and those conditions will compress the CO2, as you can see over here. Therefore, the CO2 will need much less space inside the earth than it is up on the earth. So the CO2 that you blow into a balloon before that was as big as your face might only need as big as your ton of space if it's being put underground. But how can we keep the CO2 staying in the underground? What if they step back onto the surface? So here's where my fellow geoscientists and I step in. We're looking for the best earth layer to store the CO2. But first of all, what do you think the kind of rock that can be filled with CO2? So yeah, here, we need to find the layer that is composed with porous rock, as you can see on the right-hand side, so that the CO2 can fill the spaces, as you can see between these grains. And so the CO2 can fill the spaces, but to make sure that the CO2 won't escape back onto the surface, we also need to find the earth layer that is composed of the other rocks, as you can see over here. The layer with porous rocks must be located beneath a layer that is composed of a very tight rocks like this that does not have pores at all, so that the CO2 won't escape. So that the CO2 cannot pass through the layer and move back onto the surface. So that's how CCS works. And now Margaret will be back with you to explain to you further about research and also what does CCS do to help reduce the CO2 emissions.
Hey again. So everybody already kind of heard from me, but yeah, I just want to talk a bit more about what the Carbon Center does and how you guys can all become scientists too. So just to tell you a little story, when I was in middle school, I really did not enjoy any of my science classes, and I swore that I would never pursue science and I would never want to study it after high school. But clearly that didn't happen. And I just want to tell you that science is really not as scary as sometimes people make it out to be. First, I want you guys all to think about these two questions. What is research and what is the scientific method? So anyone watching this recording may have heard about these in their classes. So research is the careful study and investigation for the purpose of discovering and explaining new knowledge. So this can really be about anything that you're interested in. It could be about flowers. It could be about whether the bees in one area are different than bees in a different area. Really anything that you could study and explain is research. And what is the scientific method? The scientific method is a method of research in which you identify a problem, and then you gather data, and then you form some hypothesis about what you think that data means, and then you test it. So again, this could really be any kind of topic. It doesn't have to be some kind of lofty idea that is really obscure. So basically, that is what we do at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center. We do research and we use the scientific method. So this is our group. These people really study a lot of different things. Some people study more chemistry topics. Some people study where to put CO2, like Meliana was talking about. Some people talk about, they research fluid flow, so you can see how those like compressed CO2 moves underground. Really so many different topics. And yeah, really, I mean, none of us presenters are really that much older than anyone watching. So you guys should just remember that this is something that you should consider, and you can really do science in whatever way you want. But this is just what the Carbon Center has kind of chosen to do. So with that, I will move on. We have a short trivia game. So this will be posted on our website later today, but I'll just kind of give a preview of what is going on. So today's categories in our game are greenhouse gases, carbon in the air and carbon in the ground, and then carbon capture and storage. So on your own time or with your teacher, maybe with some of your friends, you can go ahead and look at all these questions. So I can just give a few samples. Some of the questions are, how is the atmosphere like a car window? What happens to the atoms in CO2 when the sun hits them? So you guys can go back and look at this on your own time, but I just want to know you guys to know that it's available to you. So thank you. I think that should be it.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Susan Hovorka. Thank you for being with me on this video presentation. I'd like to make a presentation to you of some work that results from my experience in trying to develop projects for climate mitigation using the technology carbon capture and geologic storage. The key thing that you need to do to make a project is to arrange to pay for it. If you'd like to participate in this activity, get a pencil and paper to take some notes. I'm at the University of Texas at Austin in the Gulf Coast Carbon Center. So it's free to release CO2 to the atmosphere. Burn anything that's got carbon in it. It doesn't matter if you burn what it is. If you burn a renewable fuel like wood or charcoal, camel dung, or coal or oil or gas, propane, and wax. It all leads to the same outcome in terms of emissions. Carbon compounds are oxidized, light and heat are produced, what we want. The CO2 is released to the atmosphere. If you want to avoid climate change, you have to pay for the energy and products that are carbon reduced. So you can prove this to yourself by trying to shop for a carbon reduced product. There's a premium on that for an electric vehicle, for example. So write down a carbon reduced product. Think of one. The cost that's in the that you pay for can either be a carrot, meaning that there was a benefit provided. For example, provide various types of support for renewables like wind or solar, or it can be a stick, something that you're not allowed to exceed a certain amount of carbon emissions or other issues. So remember to put the cost either something that's favorable or something that's unfavorable. Both of them lead to costs. And to say that you're going to have the energy company pay is fiction. If you make your electricity provider prove their process to reduce pollution or carbon emissions, they're going to pass that cost on to you. So let's take some examples to see that this is true. Pay for environmental quality is how it's done. So we go back to the turn of the century and we see that at Niagara Falls, a number of industries are using the available water and they're taking the water in through their plant and they're releasing the damaged water out to the environment. It's not okay. It's not okay. This you won't find happening anymore. But this was accomplished by a stick, the Safe Drinking Water Act. This federal law that said that all the water has to be treated and brought back up to high water quality standards. And it's basically worked. There's also local regulations. And this caused the industries to avoid water use and water damage in industrial settings. So they found ways to not take water from the river and put it back in the river, but take a closed process so that they were using the same water over and over, recycling. And you could look at the cost of water treatment, for example, on your, if you pay for your utilities, you'll see that usually attached to your water usage bill is a water cleanup bill, so that when you flush your toilet, it does not go out, it goes to a facility, and they charge you for the treatment of that water to bring it back up to acceptable standards. And for environmental quality is also how it's done here. That we don't put our garbage out in the yard. We don't bury it on our property anymore. Although I lived in a house once that had a dump on its property. It wasn't pleasant. We put the cost of trash cleanup in our utility bills, pay it to a provider or our city or a private company that comes and collects the trash. And what does that pay for? It pays for these people, it pays for the truck, it pays for it to be taken to a facility where the trash is properly disposed of. And it helps us, it also helps incentivize the reduce and recycling of materials, because the cost of disposing of trash is significant, so that it helps us learn to avoid this cost. You could look at the cost of your trash service, how much you pay per month to avoid this environmental damage. So we should apply this to our efforts to reduce carbon, the same attitude that we need to pay to have the CO2 atmospheric release mitigated. What does this cost go to? So we see here, we're going to talk an example here about carbon capture and geologic storage, where we're taking CO2 out of flue gas. This is a facility that was built in Houston at the WA Parish plant. The flue gas, CO2 was released to atmosphere. This facility takes the flue gas and treats it so that the CO2 is captured and put in a pipeline and injected underground, so it makes it a closed loop. So not to emit to atmosphere, we can do this. This is happening at a very large scale. The processes are, but you have to pay. You have to pay for this capture equipment. As you can see, it's quite a pricey bit of kit. You have to pay for the pipeline, all the CO2 to a safe place for it to be turned underground. You have to pay for the wells. You have to pay for parasitic energy costs. You remember in the last picture we saw the guys taking the trash out to the curb, well, and the truck hauling it off. Well, equivalent in the carbon handling world is we have to pay for the operation of this equipment that handles the CO2, gets it, prepares it for, cleans it and prepares it for shipping, and that's an energy penalty. And we have to pay for what I do, which is assurance and permanence of storage underground. So let's take a minute and think about all the things that mitigate that produce waste CO2. So get out your pencil and paper. It takes 30 seconds for you to write down all the things you can think of that might produce CO2. I'm going to start in the morning. I get up. What do I do? Did I use carbon? Emit carbon to the atmosphere. Okay, I'm up to good morning, coffee break, lunchtime. What am I doing at lunchtime? Okay, I'm coming home. I'm going to have my evening. What am I using carbon for at that point? All right, this is not an inclusive list, so you might have some things I didn't think about, but just to give you some ideas, might have used the hot water, and the hot water heater either has a gas fire in it, in which case it's burning just like our candle, or maybe using electric power that's still using power, but it's being generated at maybe, if you're lucky, the WA Parish plant where it's being mitigated. Cooking, so you may use a flame or you may use the microwave that's using electricity. In fact, the food itself has quite a carbon burden, both for the fertilizer, or animal feedstock, or the preparation of that food, for the transportation, for the refrigeration, and of course the energy you got it used to get it home and cook it. The electrical energy from your light, computer, phone, don't forget that. These things are important. Anything that's made of plastic has the plastic process of making plastic releases CO2. Anything that was brought to you by a truck, even if you're riding your bicycle, great for many reasons, but if that bicycle came by truck, put it in your budget. Driving, any transportation that you're taking, even count an electric vehicle, unless you live in a place that you have solar only, wind only power, you're using hard fossil for this transportation. So we're talking about environmental justice issues, and I don't think they're huge, but they're worth considering. The key thing is that decarbonized energy and products cost more. So this is regressive. That heavier burden on people who have less, they spend a higher proportion of their income on energy and basics. The issue of putting pipelines is always a hot button issue. These are CO2 pipelines to eliminate a problem, but they still access property. And in fact, paying for CO2 to be stored in a location is a benefit to the property owner who may get an additional source of income. But there may be a source of unfairness to non-owners who will get traffic and activities on the property that they may not feel comfortable with. What can you do in this context about getting lower carbon by 2030? So you could find out the carbon mix of your own power, visit your energy provider. Most energy providers are proud of their efforts. what percentage of your energy is decarbonized and what percentage still has to work. If you look at your own carbon liability, here's the site. If you look at the EPA or your carbon footprint, you'll find a number of calculators. Look at your own carbon emissions profile and become aware of it. You can let people know that you do pay now not to let sewage into rivers. You do pay now to have your trash collected properly and recycled as much as possible. And you will pay to have your electricity, your heat, your light, your products avoid releasing waste CO2 to the atmosphere. So that's your action. Begin discussing the cost and your willingness to pay the cost to decarbonize your life. If you'd like more information, love to hear from you. This is our website, GulfCoastCarbonCenter.org. Thank you for your time and interest.
Hello and welcome. My name is Emily Moskal and I work with a lab group called the Gulf Coast Carbon Center within UT Austin's Bureau of Economic Geology at the State Geological Survey. Today, I'll talk about misinformation and climate change. Misinformation is false information that is spread regardless of whether there is intent to mislead. In 2011, property owners in Canada noticed CO2 bubbling to a soil pit. The property was above a geological carbon storage site. Property owners claimed that it was a direct result of leakage from the project. Before independent scientists could respond, a news flurry claimed that the leak was in fact from the underground reservoir. In this case, fortunately, many news outlets covered the finding of no leakage from the project, but citizens may not have followed the news story through its cycle. This is one example of misinformation. The news outlets used the claims of a couple to assure that there was in fact leakage when there wasn't. News like this could discourage the public from accepting climate change mitigation options and cause undue concerns. There are many consequences to misinformation. In one paper cites, authors claim that misinformation about climate change has confused the public, led to political inaction, and stalled support for or led to the rejection of mitigation policies. And this is important because if we're to take climate action by 2030, each news article that has misinformation that's against mitigation options or not factual can cause the public to not accept it and delay our action. Climate action is time constrained. By 2050, we need to reach net zero emissions to avoid catastrophic environmental damage. Most likely way to meet these targets is pursuing a portfolio of mitigation options according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and coverage needs to reflect this. There are two common types of misinformation. One is alarmism. This usually is doom and gloom stories. Not all of these stories are alarmism, but exaggerated effects of climate change can qualify. This leaves the readers with a sense of hopelessness. The next type of misinformation is climate denial. One common complaint of the media is giving voices to climate change deniers. One common complaint of journalists is that reporting on climate deniers reinforces that belief that climate change isn't real. One type of story, considered an example of solutions journalism, counters this with stories of climate action with real results. Solutions journalism offers hope in a doom and gloom media environment. To find stories of change, you can search the tracker, a database of positive stories at this link. Not all misinformation stories have the intention to mislead. Although many stories do not have the intention to mislead, many journalists do not have the information or the time they need to properly report a story on tight deadlines. Particularly local outlets that cover one incident without the comprehensive coverage available of a future story. This is also called churning the news cycle. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit of how to analyze the quality of a story. Here is a list of common red flags that you might find in a story. 1 is opinions outside of op-eds and editorials. 2 is all or nothing reasoning, broad statements, little to no citations, obscure non-relevant sources, out of date, or polarized outlets. Often if a news story cites other media sources rather than primary sources, that might be a questionable article. One technique to analyze a story is called Sift. First, you stop and think about the reputation of the claim and outlet. Don't share until you do this. Investigate the source. Is a Nobel Prize winning scientist writing the story you're quoted? They're likely a credible source. What is an organization that advocates for a certain position writing on a controversial topic? Be apprehensive and find better coverage. Sometimes we run across a story that intrigues us, but the outlet isn't reputable. Perform a cross search about the topic. Are more reputable outlets saying similar things? Find a consensus. Trace claims. Many stories have been stripped out of context. Trace the claim back to its original source. Another technique is called sheep. This is to not get tricked by online misinformation. So remember these checks when browsing social media. The first check is source. Look at what lies beneath. Check about the page of a website or account. Look at any account info and search for names or usernames. The second check is history. Does the source have an agenda? Find out what subjects it regularly covers and promotes only one perspective. The third check is evidence. Explore the details of a claim or meme and find out if it's backed by reliable evidence from elsewhere. The fourth check is emotion. Does the source rely on emotion to make a point? Check for sensational, inflammatory, and divisive language. And the last, fourth check is pictures paint 1,000 words. Identify what message an image is portraying and whether the source is using images to get attention. Think sheep before you share. So what you're looking for is a balanced view. For a quick way to access a story, look for headlines that pose a question or don't oversell the technology as the solution to climate change. For example, direct air capture offers some promise in reducing emissions. The method offers potential in helping reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but faces technological and economic hurdles. So it already states some problems that the technology might have, but there's still hope. Another example is, can we arrest global warming by yanking CO2 from the atmosphere? Again, this poses a question and leaves room for balanced view and opposing sides. As information gets more complex and varied and accessible, misinformation isn't going away. With the internet, millions around the globe have access to share information. The information available increases through time. You now have some tools to critically assess a story and increase your credibility. As I mentioned earlier, there's been some misinformation about the technology we work on, carbon capture and storage. So I want to go through a little ways that you can find primary sources in the literature on CCS. One source is the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The second is EPA Underground Injection Control Program. And thirdly, the Clean Air Act. IPCC reports. These are written by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group of climate experts that assess the current state of knowledge around climate change. They are one of the largest authorities on climate change, and the reports have chapters of mitigation pathways, impacts, global response, and sustainable development. Each report assesses each mitigation technology separately and as a whole in the portfolio to fight climate change. The second source is the EPA Underground Injection Control Program. This regulates the underground injection of CO2 in Class 6 wells. It's designed to protect underground sources of drinking water. The program requires proper siting, materials, operating, monitoring, financial responsibility, and reporting of operators. The third source of information is the Clean Air Act. This has been around since the 1970s. It regulates sources of emissions, stationary or mobile, and includes regulations for cars. It requires greenhouse gas reporting for suppliers of CO2, including CO2 capture, underground injection, and geologic sequestration of CO2. So when you're going through the primary sources of information, they can also be often be very technical, and you'll need guidance going through the documents. So when you have questions, go straight to a representative in the agency or a researcher for interpretation. Don't rely on yourself to understand the intricacies or go to a secondary source. These people know the best. So my action to mitigate misinformation and to encourage climate change action is to write a letter to the editor. So a couple of tips to do this is, number one, follow newsroom AP style. You've probably heard of Chicago style when you're writing papers for school, but this is what journalists use. Second, state your claim in a lead, the first sentence or two that grabs the reader's attention. Third, give societal relevance, why the letter is newsworthy. Explain background of issue, make your argument, outline your points above, and devote about a paragraph to each if length permits. Keep it to about 700 words, research their website to find out more, but often under 200 words, for example, the New York Times. Here's an example of a letter to the editor in the New York Times about climate change. So they title it to the editor, and then you want to list the title of the article. So here they say, read what the pandemic means for climate change, link to the article, state the author, and then state the outlet and the date. So she goes on to say, in Los Angeles, New York, Manila, and Milan, the sky is clear as air pollution drops, link. In Venice, the canal water is clear enough to see fish and dolphins are returning. What would the world be like if we decided to pursue this trend? So they kind of create an image that you want to see, and that's the attention grabber. So the issue is less asthma and cancer, fewer lung and heart diseases, fewer deaths, more beauty in our lives, a slowing of global emissions. Coronavirus, newsworthy, is catastrophic, but it opens a new path. What if the frantic rush hours, relentless production of often unneeded or quickly obsolete items, and nonstop consumer spending were to calm? If we invested in renewable energy, electric cars, and public transportation, and stopped funding fossil fuels, would we create good jobs and improve health for ourselves and the planet? So there they kind of go on to the solution, and it follows the newsworthiness. So she goes on to say, before it was hard to envision such a change, but now we can see glimpses of what it might offer. Any new stimulus bill in the United States should include funds for a transition to a more sustainable world. We owe it to our children and grandchildren. So here she states what she wants, so because it's an opinion piece, a new stimulus bill. And then she also grabs the reader's emotional response by referencing children and grandchildren. So that's a great example of a letter to the editor. Hello and welcome.